Bonjour tout le monde. Sego, good morning everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada's 25th Annual Conference. My name is Daniel Bélan, and I'm the director of MISC and your host this morning. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir ce matin pour la deuxième journée de notre conférence. Aujourd'hui, nous avons des tables rondes sur l'économie du savoir, la façon dont nous pouvons mieux affronter les changements climatiques et la place du Canada dans le monde. Je terminerai la conférence aujourd'hui par un discours et quelques remarques de clôture, et j'espère que vous pourrez vous joindre à nous. You can access all sessions today by clicking on the links in the agenda session of the WOVA platform. Please feel free to tweet along at us by tagging us at MISCCAN, M-I-S-C-C-A-N, and using the hashtag MISC25, M-I-S-C 25. I want to remind you that we have simultaneous translation today. So you can click at the bottom right of your screen on the icon for interpretation, and then you can switch to English or French at will. On a aujourd'hui la traduction simultanée. Vous pouvez aller au bas à droite de votre écran et puis vous avez le choix entre anglais et français ou pas de traduction simultanée du tout. Donc, vous entendez la langue originale toujours, la langue qui est parlée par l'interlocuteur. We are pleased to begin today with a keynote, a speech from Terri Givens. Terri Givens grew up in Spokane, Washington, and loves the outdoors. She began her career on the faculty at the University of Washington and has held leadership positions as vice provost at the University of Texas, Austin, and provost of Menlo College. She was the founding director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas and led the faculty and staff at Menlo College in developing programs for first-generation students, updating curriculum, and creating infrastructure for evidence-based assessment. She is the author, editor of books and articles on immigration policy, European politics, and the politics of race. Her most recent book is the memoir, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And of course, we are really glad that Terri Givens recently joined McGill University. She's involved in the administrative level in the fight against racism, and she's also a full professor in the Department of Political Science here at McGill. So I will now, of course, let Terri speak, and following the talk, we'll have a brief Q&A session, so I will ask her a few questions about her work. Terri, merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. It's all yours.
Merci bien, Daniel. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici. And I will start with sharing my screen so we can see my PowerPoint. Let me put that into full screen mode. All right. So again, thank you for having me here today. It is really a great pleasure to participate in this conference. And I hope that this talk will be of interest to all of you. It's really a topic that is very current, but also it's something that I've been looking at for most of my career. So for those who don't know, my first book was Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. And I have been studying Europe since I was an undergraduate at Stanford University. One of my first experiences in France was in 1986. I was an undergraduate and happened to do my study abroad in France in a time when the radical right was just on the rise. In fact, I arrived in France in April of 1986, which was when the election occurred, where Jean-Marie Le Pen's National Front Party actually won seats in the French Assembly because they had switched to proportional representation. And Danielle, so that's a good takeoff point for our questions later, the impact of party systems and elections. But in any case, there has been a lot of discussion about the rise of the far right, but I've also been focusing on the politics of immigration, and as well as issues of race and immigration in Europe. So that will be somewhat the focus of my discussion today. But this is based on my forthcoming book called The Roots of Racism, which looks at the transatlantic ties around race and discrimination. And that book will be actually appearing, if I can get to my proofs this weekend, in January. I'm in the process of reviewing the final proofs. So that is on my agenda for the weekend. So one of the things that I have learned over my many years of studying these topics is that we're seeing this conflation of immigration and race. And that began in the US as well as in Canada with a focus on immigration control in the late 1800s, early 1900s on Chinese immigrants. And not only Chinese immigrants, but there was I could spend a lot of time talking about all the different things that focused on basically keeping non-white people out of the US and Canada. And so immigration control itself was a form of controlling the number of non-white people coming into several countries, the US, Canada, Australia. And so, of course, later in the 1920s, the US passed two different versions of immigration control, which led to quotas that focused on keeping most of our immigration coming from North and Western Europe. There was a bias against people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, people of Catholic background, and of course, anti-Semitism became a big factor in the 1930s and 40s in US policy in terms of allowing visas and people to get in, Jews in Europe to get visas to come to the US. But in any case, there's always been this connection between our immigration policies and race. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that has impacted political science. But of course, we had Reconstruction to Jim Crow in the US, where the end of slavery did not lead to an end of segregation and violence against African Americans. Jim Crow was designed to basically keep Black people in their place. And so along with the policies that were focusing on Asian, Chinese, Japanese, and others immigrants, there was also policies being put in place, particularly in the southern part of the US, but not just in the southern part of the US, to keep Black people from being able to vote, to own homes, to have property, all these different things that should have happened and at the end of the Civil War. So in the 1920s, we see the closing of the door to immigration, and that door did not really open again until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, we had the passage of not only new immigration policies, which focused on basically family reunification, which was felt that by passing laws that focused on family ties, that it would keep the flow of immigrants from becoming too racialized. But indeed, that change in policy opened the door to many groups who had not had access to visas and so on in the US. And also, of course, you had the passage of civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, and so on, that opened up new opportunities for not only African Americans, but people of other racialized backgrounds. And so we've also seen more recently a lot of demographic change, and that's partly because of the changes to immigration policy. We have seen, the growth in Latinx communities, in people coming from Africa, in people coming from the Middle East, India, et cetera. And so these demographic changes have led to the backlash that we're seeing today and the attack on voting rights, the attacks on education, the attacks on critical race theory, which really is not being taught in K through 12 schools, at least not what we political scientists and law professors call critical race theory. So in any case, we've seen this overlapping of immigration and race, since we've become a country, pretty much, that these connections have been there. And so let me go to my next slide. So more recently, we've seen these shifting discourses about immigration and race. And for me, this started with the radical right in the 1980s. As I mentioned, I happened to be in France in 1986. But I do want to mention, not only did you see the rise of Jean-Marie Le Pen and his party, Le Front National, but you also saw shifts towards anti-discrimination policy. So it was in the 1980s, as I describe in my book, Legislating Equality, that the European Parliament was paying attention to attacks on immigrants in Europe, and began to focus on how can we develop anti-discrimination policy. And so I tracked that up until the passage of the EU's Racial Equality Directive in 2000. And so in the 1990s, when I was conducting my dissertation research, I was following the rise of Jörg Haider in Austria, who was a far-right politician who was kind of anti-EU, and as well as being focusing on immigration and talking about waves of migrants and so on. And so Jörg Haider's party actually in 1999 was successful enough to get into the Austrian parliament. In that election, they basically came in second behind the Austrian People's Party, the Conservative Party, and Haider saw how this led to great consternation amongst other EU countries, and decided not to step in and be part of the government. But in any case, that led to the passage of the Racial Equality Directive, because the other EU countries decided that they wanted to do something to show that they weren't racist, that Haider and his party weren't going to dominate the politics of the EU. And so if you're interested in that, my book, Legislating Equality, goes into great detail on what happened around that and the implementation of the RED. But also during that time period, we have Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schröder. They were all, although they were left politicians, they were also, kind of these new neoliberals who were for basically cutting back the welfare state, and their policies really undermined, the work of unions and so on. And so we saw that these shifting discourses away from, a more generous state to a focusing on getting people back to work. Clinton's immigration policies denied welfare benefits to some people who had green cards, which also encouraged people to become citizens. And then beyond that, we saw the decline of the left, which is something that's still being dealt with in Europe. And at the same time, we had Islamophobia and terrorism, a shift to focusing on immigration and security, a big focus on Muslim migrants. In the US, we had most recently under the previous president, the Muslim ban. But also, again, coming from the other direction, we have the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against the numerous killings of African Americans in the US. And of course, those protests spread around the world. But the other component of this is that we've seen the discourses around that were really part of the far right in the 1990s and the early 2000s has shifted into the discourse of the mainstream right. And for example, we saw Angela Merkel and Lionel Jospin and David, and I'm forgetting the British Prime Minister's name at the moment. That's what happens when you get into your 50s, folks. But in any case, we saw this discourse around that multiculturalism had failed, basically, And this, although we also saw Angela Merkel being a champion of refugees in Germany in 2015-16, when a million refugees came into Germany. So we've seen these shifting discourses, but there is a lot of back and forth between the movements that are trying to fight racism, and whether countries are open or not to immigration, and the discourses of the far right. And we could talk, if you have questions about that, Danielle, I'd be more than happy to talk more about that. So one of the things I focus on in my book is the role of political science and race. And I kind of start this off with discussing the fact that there's this W.B. Du Bois in the 1920s said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And, unfortunately, structural racism remains an intractable problem in the 21st century, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Canada. And I argue that it's because norms around the idea of whiteness are embedded in our societies. And part of the problem is that political science itself had, unfortunately, it was of its times in the early 1900s, as certain racist tendencies, and it was part of those norms that were developing, the structural discrimination and racism that basically kept African Americans from even being able to become political scientists, which is why one of the reasons I'm at McGill today, as a professor, is also to work on this issue of bringing in more Black faculty. And part of the problem is, if you do not have people who have those lived experiences, the questions aren't being asked. So Robert Vitalis has a great book that talks about kind of the issues that were going on around race, with the political science going back to its founding. What we need to have more of is this process tracing, historical and discursive institutionalism that traces why we are here, where we are today. And how that, it's interesting. I wrote an article for annual reviews in, I think it was 2007, that focused on immigrant integration and how political science had not really grappled with these issues in a way that could, help us understand the politics surrounding these topics, why policies were being passed the way they were. And so I think it's really important that we have this process tracing, looking at the history and understanding that it's important to have your representation in political science, because it's only been since the 1980s, 90s that we've even done surveys that talk about issues relevant to race. Asian Americans are only recently being discussed as a group, and it was really stunning to me that was really only in the 1990s we started doing surveys that focused on Latinx people. So. In any case, I highly recommend Paula McLean's APSA speech from last year. It really goes into some detail on the political science and race, and how the ways we approach topics is deeply impacted by who is asking the questions. And so I also talk about that in some detail in my forthcoming book. So one of the things I argue is that structural racism is central to politics and policy. Basically, policies are designed, first of all, we had to create the status quo, which is that people in the US, at least African Americans, were excluded from many areas of our economy, from buying homes, from being able to get certain jobs. All of these things have been central to politics and policy, because policies are either designed to keep people of color, not just African Americans, but as we saw with immigration policy, Asians and others, from having even access to the US. And so those things are still impacting our politics today. And it's very clear if you take the time to look at our neighborhoods. In France, you have the banlieue, and it's obviously the connection between class and race, but it's much of the research shows, and even in my book Radical Empathy, I talk about how structural discrimination impacts even people. It doesn't matter your education or class. For African-American women, you're still more likely to have very poor maternal and fetal health outcomes. I mean, all of these things impact African Americans because of these longstanding policies and norms that have impacted our lives. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has been considered to be this racial reckoning. And and as a result, we are seeing active change going on, where basically from governments to our educational institutions are looking and examining how structural discrimination has impacted them and how we can create change. And of course, party politics is deeply impacted by this. And in the U.S., of course, we're seeing this very stark divide between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, with the Democratic Party being much more diverse. And I don't need to go into too much detail here because I don't want to take too much time. But it's clear that party politics is very much being driven by issues of race. If we look at policies in the context of our historical understanding, we can see how these policies have been designed to perpetuate discrimination. And then, of course, we're seeing pushback, not only in France against American ideas around race coming there, but also the pushback against what is supposedly critical race theory, which has just become kind of a term to say we don't want to teach our kids history, to put it simply. But then, I also want to mention, on the other hand, there's been, not just a racial reckoning. Of course, it's the issue of Indigenous, not only in Canada, but the U.S. We had, basically the boarding schools and missions in the U.S. were very similar to what was happening in Canada. And I do believe there's going to be a reckoning there. There's already beginning to be a reckoning there. And so that is another factor that's in play. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to go talk about this conflation of immigration and race. And we're looking at how new and settled communities are shaped by migration discourses. This is an article by Errol Murgy and Navhabu, and how do migrants emerge as subjects of or beyond racism. So they talk about the different approaches that we have, changing migrations. And of course, in Europe, it's really since World War II that you've seen this larger influx of people of color and how these groups have become racialized, and then also complex migrations, differentialist racialization, which focuses on processes of racialization that differently shape migrant subjects to disadvantage in their citizenship status. Post-racial migrations, which go beyond racism, which questions as to whether racism, and racialization are meaningful analytic categories. And I think this is a point of, we have to examine. And I really think it's important that we develop empirical questions and an empirical approach to the study of race and immigration that allows us to understand, what does this look like in different countries, in different contexts? What is the politics? So I'm arguing for a new understanding of race and politics, understanding that racism is embedded in the structure of society, which is part of critical race theory, but also intersectionality, how gender and other parts of our identity also create these different components, including religion, of course, because of the focus on Muslim migrants and people of Muslim background. And so I've come up with the idea of comparative race theory that adds to the tenets of critical race theory with the following components: that those who pursue policies that perpetuate racism, inequality, and white supremacy are not bound by national borders. From the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, people in the Americas and Europe have shared ideas and policy approaches that now appear in countries around the globe. And I really detail that in the book on the roots of racism, and that racism can extend to those who may share different national origins or religions, even if they are not phenotypically distinct from the dominant society. Xenophobia is similar to racism in the types of policies that are pursued and the inequalities it creates, particularly in the context of immigration. And finally, there's value in comparing approaches to race and racism around the globe as white supremacy impacts domestic politics in many countries, as well as the relationships between countries and migration flows. And I will say I spent a lot of time in the book just talking about the development of these ideas around race, Black and white, and so on. So I think it's important that we really go in depth into the history and understand why these ideas are still dominant today. So I want to just mention some of the references because these are some of the important works that have come out. Jessica Blatt's book is fairly recent, Race in the Making of American Political Science. I mentioned Robert Vitalis, his book, White World Order, Black Power Politics, goes into the origins of American international relations and political science. Michelle Wright's Becoming Black, another really amazing book, Ashley Jardina's White Identity Politics, focuses on these topics in the US, race in France, transnational blacklist, and others. And then, very relevant to the George Floyd protests, the police power and race riots by Kathy Lisa Schneider. All right, and so what's next? So I'm now at McGill. I'm working on developing an interdisciplinary network of scholars on this issue of transnational race and working on an edited volume, which really focuses in on theory building and hypothesis testing around these issues, because we can't, I think one of the issues I have in the research is getting a good handle on what is racism, what does it look like, and how it shifts from country to country. Basically, looking at history, process tracing. One of the things I did in my legislating equality book is discourse analysis, which looks at how the discourses around race in the EU shifted over time, from focusing on the far right to anti-discrimination policy and how that led to the passage of the Racial Equality Directive. Data analysis where possible. Of course, we know that data on race is in some places is very accessible, and other places it's not even, doesn't even exist. So we have to find other ways to gather that data and develop an understanding of what is happening with racialized communities, and then developing comparative measures. How can we compare across countries in ways that are meaningful and that will allow us to do further research? So I will stop there and let us get into the discussion. I'm going to stop my share. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Terri. Great presentation. I have, of course, some questions for you. The first one, I want to bounce back about what you said regarding the current work you're doing at McGill, and you talk about your research project. I'm wondering about your actual administrative work. You're the provost, academic lead, and advisor on McGill's action plan to address anti-Black racism. And it would be interesting to tell us a bit what you're doing in that role, and what's the relationship between your administrative role at McGill and your research agenda?
Well, they're intertwined in many ways, but the work I'm doing is basically working as an advisor to the provost in the provost's office to help facilitate the implementation of the strategy. So the strategy was developed and presented by the principal a year ago in September. And in that time, they've been working on hiring staff and working with faculties to conduct searches for faculty positions. And in the last few years, McGill has gone from having only 8 African or Black faculty to 24, actually will be 25. And so already there's been a lot of work done to focus on the hiring of Black faculty. And so that's one of the roles is to work with departments. I've been meeting with different groups around campus, but also because of my book, Radical Empathy, I've been doing workshops to help departments and groups understand the impact of structural discrimination and how we can create, one of the important goals of the work is to change the culture at McGill to make it more welcoming to Black faculty, students, and staff. And so a lot of the work I'm doing even later today is around radical empathy and using the tools of radical empathy to help change the culture and help us all become more understanding and intentional about how these things impact all of us. Because one of the things that's really important to understand is that we're all in my book, Radical Empathy, I talk about the fact that even I have been impacted, in my own way of thinking and so on, by structural bias and so on. And so I've had to confront my own biases and, be willing to be vulnerable to understand how those things impact me. So I've worked with many groups. I feel like I'm giving a radical empathy workshop every week at least. And, a lot of the work revolves around the different components of the strategy. So, for example, bringing in a fellow to work around issues of race and, the history projects, various other components that, but mainly right now, I'm trying to help the team that has been hired in the last year to develop the infrastructure we need to develop a website, and to really make sure that we're communicating with the broader community. Oh, I think you're muted. Yes.
Yes, very important work. Yes, of course, it has to happen. Otherwise, it's not a Zoom. It's not a Zoom call.
Exactly.
Yes. So we'll talk, maybe return to radical empathy later. But I want to ask you a few questions about your talk itself, from a Canadian perspective. So, the rise of the far right is related in part to the fact that, say, European societies or Canadian societies, US societies, are more and more diverse in terms of racialized minorities. So when you talk about the shift in immigration policy in the US in the 1960s, we saw the same thing in Canada. And Canada up to the 1970s was really of course, there was the indigenous population, less than 5% of the population, but then it was most people were really from European descent. We had, of course, Asian and Black minorities, relatively small pockets of Black population in Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Montreal, and so forth. Asian population, especially out west. But it was still a country that was quite homogeneous from a racial standpoint. And things have changed quite dramatically. And it's something you see also in Europe, of course. Now, in Europe and the US, we've seen the rise of the far right, and even far-right parties taking power in countries like Hungary or Poland, or far-right parties becoming really strong contenders or having a lot of influence, like the Danish People's Party and the Front National. In Canada, we have not seen that, at least yet. We have a far-right party at the federal level, which is the People's Party of Canada. And at the last federal elections, they got nearly 5% of the popular vote. But they've got no seat. They won 0 seat. And that's related in part to our electoral system. And I'm wondering, and you alluded to that earlier in your talk, what's the impact of party systems, especially the difference between, say, a first past the post system versus proportional representation in terms of the political power of the far right?
Right. And that was exactly the topic of my book, Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. And so what I discovered in that study, there was so this came out, this is part of my dissertation research in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we hadn't seen really the Austrian Freedom Party was the first radical right party to really break through. But even then, I looked at the role of electoral systems and party systems to understand, how is that impacting the success of the radical right. And so actually the most interesting case study was France, because as I mentioned, I just happened to be in France in 1986 when that election happened. And we know that shift to proportional representation led to the National Front getting seats. Whereas in every other election, they had a hard time getting seats until more recently. And so it's clear that it's a combination of things. First of all, the cordon sanitaire, which is basically the idea that the mainstream parties agree that they will not collaborate with the far right to help them win seats, because in lots of electoral systems, you have to work with other parties to win seats. So in France, that came about because the conservative parties there agreed that they would not agree to have a far right candidate go into the second round of the assembly elections. And of course, they couldn't stop that when they had the proportional representation election. In Germany, the system has a 5% hurdle to keep extreme parties from gaining seats and votes. But of course, it's a very complex system. You have the part that you vote directly for a candidate. And so if you win 3 seats, you actually can get all the proportion of seats you won. Anyway, there's lots of complexities there, but there's a huge impact of party systems in the sense that if parties, agree that they aren't going to collaborate with a far right party, that actually has the impact of suppressing the vote because people see, oh, well, this party doesn't have a chance of winning any seats, so I'm not going to waste my vote on. People vote strategically. We know that. So, and that really was clear in my study of the German elections, where people vote, for a candidate in as well as a party. You have a 2-vote system, and people would not vote for the smaller parties with their second vote because they knew that only the bigger parties were going to win those seats. So in any case, it's interesting to see that interaction of, basically the parties, letting their voters, they kind of signal to their voters that we aren't going to collaborate with this party, so you're wasting your vote if you vote for them. And that broke apart, that fell apart in more recently. Basically, unfortunately, some of the parties have fallen apart. The Parti Socialiste in France has been not doing well for a long time. I mean, I could go into a lot of detail, but it's clear that that's a critical component. It's that interaction between the party system, the electoral system, and how people decide to use their vote.
Another factor when we talk about the political influence of the far right, so we see in Canada, we have a lot of far right discourse on social media, and we have a lot of racism and so forth that is easy to, and sometimes less easy to trace. But again, politically, maybe not as strong. We mentioned the issue of party system that might be part of the explanation. Another factor, I remember Will Kimlicka writing about that some years ago, about illegal immigration, quote unquote. So the idea that in the United States, it's been a big issue with the the US-Mexico border, not so much the Canada-US border. And it's been an issue also in Europe. With the idea of, moral panic about some of these waves of Syrian refugees or other refugees, what we saw happening over the last decade. But this has not been such a big issue in Canada, with some exceptions we see here in Lacolle in Quebec, but not to the same extent. So do you think that's a factor that in Canada, because illegal immigrations, quote unquote, is not as a prevalent issue, that might not give enough political ammunition to the far right to actually get more votes?
Yeah, it's not just only that there's less illegal immigration, it's that Canada has a very different conception of itself when it comes to immigration. And actually, I'm teaching my course on immigration politics this semester, and we talked about public opinion last week. And if you look, I mean, in Canada, it was something like 60% of Canadians believe that, immigration is a good thing. And so the sentiment is very different. I mean, although if you look, the majority of Americans also believe that immigration is a good thing. It's just not as high as in Canada. It's also it's a decision by political elites, right? I mean, there was a time, especially when George W. Bush became president, that he was ready to take on the immigration issue and was ready to talk. He talked to Vicente Fox in Mexico. They were, and then of course 9/11 happened. I think if 9/11 hadn't happened, the US would have comprehensive immigration reform right now. We would not have this huge, massive presence of border police and border patrol at the Mexico border. I mean, it would be a very different situation. And so, part of it has to do with, what issues the parties latch on to. But also, there's the impact of, events. The whole issue of terrorism in the US and Europe has played a huge factor in the securitization of immigration. And Canada has had a few little attacks here and there, but nothing as massive as what we've seen in the US and Europe. So I think that is also a factor.
Yes. Another factor that you mentioned, 9/11, the September 11, 2001, not to be confused with the advent of Pinochet dictatorship, September 11, 1973, which is a different September 11 for people in Chile, and not certainly also bright day. COVID-19. When I mentioned Maxime Bernier and his performance in terms of the People's Party of Canada getting nearly 5% of the vote, compared to only, I think, 1.6% of the votes back in 2019, it seems that the party and the far right, at least in Canada, has used the pandemic, and especially backlash against vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, although we see polling data actually show that vaccine passports are much more popular in Canada than they are in the United States. But I think that the performance of the People's Party in Canada is related to the pandemic, exploiting the anxiety over the pandemic, and also drawing on some of the conspiracy theories that are circulating out there. So I would say also people not trusting government, right? So when you look at other countries, you look at the United States, you look at European countries you work on, you've been working on for many, many years. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the politics of immigration and on the rise or the stagnation, or maybe in some countries like Germany, perhaps the decline even of the far right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the jury's still out because it's still early days. And, I think if you look at, for example, what's happening in the UK, it was kind of, Brexit, and then you had Brexit and then COVID. I mean, those two things I think are playing an important role in what's going on in UK politics. In the rest of Europe, I mean, Germany, we'll see, I mean, we saw the decline, but I think I would say we'll have to see how this new government plays out. And, I'm hopeful because of, the increase in support for left parties that the far right might be having less influence, because of course, it's this, as you see the kind of attenuation of the party systems, as you get more on the far right and the far left, that you've seen the center parties losing strength. And so that's still happening, right? I mean, and it happened in Germany. The center parties, the percentage of the vote they're getting is not as strong as it has been in the past. So, are we seeing a continuing kind of push to the extremes, or are we going to see more of a shift back to the middle? It's not clear to me what direction that is going to go. And it's interesting when I was conducting my dissertation research in the late 90s, everyone kept telling me, oh, the far right, they're just a flash in the pan. And, you shouldn't be studying this. And my book, I concluded my research around 2002. My book came out in 2005. And, by then I had shifted to studying immigration politics because the EU had taken on immigration as a policy. And I'm not sorry I did that, but, it's interesting to see how all of a sudden people are paying much more attention. Obviously, they're doing better electorally. So, it's really hard to say because we have, COVID has definitely catalyzed a certain component of the electorate, but I think it's just building on what was already there and underlying. So I think that, we'll see how things go in the next year, especially if we, if we actually do get to a more normal situation, what is going to be the next thing that the far right parties latch on to? If it's not COVID, then, and the mask mandates and so on, what will the next focus be?
And thinking about the future and about how do we fight racism and how we might try to contain the far right, or even going farther than that. You mentioned Black Lives Matter, and certainly there are other groups, networks that are fighting racism and far right discourses. And we see that Black Lives Matter has become transnational in nature. We have in Canada Black Lives Matter, and they have an alliance with Indigenous organizations and so forth. How effective are these campaigns? And also, do you think that this is also a flash in the pan in terms of Black Lives Matter and its transnational aspect, or it's something that actually could really crystallize and institutionalize in a way, or or exist in the long run. Because I remember, for example, Occupy Wall Street, and that was a bit of flash in the pan, although it was, people have been talking more about inequality since that, but it has not lasted. We had in Canada too, Idle No More in terms of Indigenous peoples, and it has not, there are legacies of this, but it's not what it was a few years back. So what do you think is the long-term prospect for Black Lives Matters and similar organizations? And what's their role in fighting racism?
So I think that it's not necessarily Black Lives Matter that will have lasting impact. It's the fact that, for example, I'm at McGill. That's what's going to have lasting impact, right? It's that we're in. I think, we've seen a year after, George Floyd, there's been some frustration that we're still not seeing a lot of change. But actually, I do think the change is happening, that, people are getting hired into positions to work on these issues in different companies. And of course, they're fighting a backlash. So we can't forget that, there's been, this huge backlash against Black Lives Matter. So, it's a matter of, and it's always been that way, right? You have the civil rights movement, you have that backlash. But what we're seeing is, especially in the US, is an attack on, things like voting rights, because they're afraid of, these movements and the people of color gaining more political power. And so, the question, I think it's moving into the political realm now, where we have to, and it, of course, always has been. I mean, a year ago we had an election. You saw what happened in Georgia, and the impact of people like Stacey Abrams. And I think that's where the lasting legacy is going to have to focus going forward, is ensuring that people are able to vote, that they're able to have representatives that truly represent them. And this is true, around the globe, that it is important that this become institutionalized. And that's, even at McGill, that's part of my goal, is to make sure that the things that we are doing now become institutionalized, and that we're passing laws that are pushing for equality. And I mean, in many ways, regardless of political background, I think it's important that we understand that, voting rights is such an underlying, important critical component of all of this. And it's the same thing they were fighting for during the civil rights movement. And it's unfortunately that we're still having that fight today.
Thank you. Yes, great remarks about institutionalization. We're almost out of time, but I would like to end by returning to your book. It's hard with the screen inverted, but it's Radical Empathy that came out earlier this year. And I read it this summer, and I thought it was really illuminating. And I would like maybe us to conclude with maybe a plug, but tell us why Canadians, tell us a bit more about this book, which I think is really accessible, excellent, very well written. Why should Canadians read this book? Because you start from your experience as an American political scientist, then you talk about your work on Europe. But I think that the message of the book and the concept of radical empathy is also something that could or should have a transnational life. That's not just about the United States or Europe. So tell us a bit more about the book and why we should read it here in Canada.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I felt frustration that, since I'd been born, I was born in 1964 as of tomorrow, or be 57 as of tomorrow. And so it was just like, if you had asked me 20 years ago, I said, oh, we're doing great. Look at all the opportunity I've had. My first generation college goer, I went to school at Stanford and UCLA and PhD. But the reality, one of the things that stunned me, I start the book talking about how my father passed away from a heart attack. And when I started doing research, I realized just the fact that he's an African-American male put him at high risk for dying from a first heart attack. Later on, I learned all about maternal and fetal health outcomes. Doesn't matter your education or wealth. If you're an African-American woman, you're more likely to die in pregnancy, and your child is more likely to have poor health outcomes. And there was a great New York Times magazine research into this, and so it was like, how do we create change, real change? And so I really had to go in and look at my own life story and understand, and become vulnerable, because the first step to radical empathy is willingness to be vulnerable. And I have 6 steps to radical empathy: willingness to be vulnerable, being grounded in who you are, being open to the experiences of others, practicing empathy, taking action. And the radical part of it is taking action and creating change and building trust. And as that is exactly what Canada is going through right now, in terms of looking at its past, in terms of how things the Indigenous have been dealt with. Canada has to be vulnerable right now and say, yes, we made mistakes. Canada has to be grounded in who it is as a country. It's been homogenous, but it's changed. So it's not just at the end of, I think it's really important that we start at the individual level, but as a country, we have to go through these reckonings. And, I talk about truth and reconciliation in my last chapter, and my experiences in South Africa and Germany. And so it's incredibly relevant globally, right? And that's why my next step is to talk about the roots of racism. And so the 2 books are very much connected, because as I was writing Radical Empathy, I was like, people don't understand the history. And this is why there's so much fear around critical race theory, because we have to understand our history. Canada is trying not to turn away from its history right now. And so I'm trying to lay out the history in a way that we can see the linkage between what happened in the 14 and 1500s with slavery and why we are where we are today. And so, even the fact that we have race, goes back to that time period. But the perpetuation of it is something we have to acknowledge and understand. And it's not just about, Africans being enslaved. It's about the Indigenous being enslaved and put in, and murdered. All these different things. And so it's all of a piece that comes to, how whiteness has become normalized and so on. And we have to be very intentional to move past that.
Thank you very much, Terri. I think what your work shows is how important it is when we deal with issues like racism in the far right, to take a comparative perspective and really a transnational perspective as well. Mm-hmm. Because some of the negative ideas or prejudice, they travel. We have international networks of racist groups that are transnational now and so forth. We see that on social media, but we have also people who reach out to one another across national borders to fight racism and hatred. And I think your work is an important contribution to that conversation and that effort. So thank you very much, Terri. We are really glad to have you at McGill as well, of course, for the years to come. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be in the same department as you, of course, in political science. Merci tout le monde pour votre attention. Nous avons une autre session qui commence dans à peine 20 minutes à 11h15. We have another session that begins at 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And this session will be about the knowledge economy in Canada. Different topic, but also a topic that deals with global factors and processes. And so I hope to see you again at the beginning of that session in 20 minutes. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
Merci. Au revoir.
Au revoir.